And Dr. R.C. Sproul tells a great story about this. He said he was in a classroom, university classroom, where he was teaching Bible, and he was teaching on the doctrines of grace, also known as 5 points of Calvinism. And he convinced the class the first week. He said, he taught on total depravity, and everybody said they believed it. And he said, well, I want you to come sign your name on the chalkboard if you affirm total depravity. And everybody in the class came and signed their name and affirmed total depravity. Now, the next week, he came in and taught unconditional election. And all the hands go up and all the things, disagreement, didn't like that. And he said, well, if you affirm total depravity, then you have to affirm unconditional election. And one at a time, he said they came up and erased their names because they realized that they didn't affirm unconditional election. They really were not affirming total depravity. So the whole of Calvinism is really based upon man's natural inabilities. We call it. In fact, that was another thing R.C. used to say was rather than calling it total depravity, it'd be better to call it radical inability. Mm-hmm. He said, but then you get rulip, and it doesn't really work. So you want to have tulip. So anyway, unconditional election is that God chooses for salvation those whom he wills, and that choice is not based upon anything good in the creature, because if total depravity is true, there is no good in the creature for him to choose. And this, again, goes back to the idea that there's nothing in us that is inclined to believe or to have faith or to abandon our fleshly desires. And so unconditional election is the idea that God will choose based upon the counsel of his own will. And we see this in Ephesians chapter 1, where it talks about God choosing us in him before the foundation of the world. Now, some people believe that clause in him actually indicates that God chose a unnamed group in Christ, and that's how election works. And as long as you get into Christ, you are elect. And yet, if you look at the actual sentence structure, it says he chose us in him. And so we are the object of the choice. And so he chose us in him before the foundation of the world. And then, of course, we have the ever-present stickling passage that so many people overlook or don't want to talk about, and that is Romans chapter 9, where Paul, very clearly talking about the two brothers, Jacob and Esau, said that he had chosen one and not the other before they had done anything good or bad, to show that his purpose of election would stand. Now, the problem that some Calvinists have to wrestle with is that passage where it says, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated, is taken from Malachi and is referencing the nations of the nations of Israel and Edom. And so a lot of people will say, well, this doesn't have anything to do with individuals, it has to do with nations. And then my response to that has always been, well, even if that were the case, and I don't really think that's borne out by Paul's use of Jacob and Esau as individuals, but even if it were referring to nations, now your problem is just exacerbated because God has chosen an entire nation over an entire other nation. So the election is still there. It's just now more than just the one Jacob and the one Esau. And I remind people, too, that in the book of Amos, chapter 3, it says, God is speaking to Israel, and he says, you only have I known of all the nations of the world. So he says, you only have I known. And the word know there, as you being a Calvinist, you're familiar with the way God uses the word know. Some people don't realize this, but the word know doesn't just mean the passive taking in of knowledge, but rather the active entering into of a relationship. Mm-hmm. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7, for those who said, Lord, Lord, will we not do this? Did we not do that? And he says, depart from me, I never knew you. That wasn't meaning that he did not know their names, but rather that he did not know them in a saving way. He didn't have a relationship with them. So when God says to Israel, you only have I known of all the nations of the earth, he's saying, you only have I entered into a relationship with. And the funny thing is about election is most people don't have a problem with God choosing Israel. They don't have a problem with God overlooking, as it were, the Edomites, or passing over the Amalekites, or even sending judgment upon the Canaanites or the Amalekites. People seem to think God was totally just in doing that, but when it comes to new covenant salvation, and you say, well, God is also in the business of choosing his own, even on this side of the cross, people tend to get much more upset.